There are secrets that cling to the shadows, desperate to be told. We dragged them into the light. Welcome to Gravevale Echoes. Porthgenna Tower did not simply stand on the Cornish coast. It clawed at the sky, a grim finger of granite, worn smooth by centuries of salt and storm. It was a place that seemed to have been born from the sea's angriest moods. On nights like this, when a gale screamed in from the Atlantic, the tower became an instrument played by the wind, and its music was a symphony of moans and whistles. The sea itself was a beast, hurling its white-maned head against the black cliffs below, its roar a constant, hungry sound that seeped through stone and settled deep in the bones. For Sarah Leeson, every step up the winding turret staircase was a descent into a colder, deeper level of fear. The stone beneath her worn shoes was damp and frigid, and the air was thick with the chilling trinity of smells that defined the old tower. The brine of the sea, the ancient dust of ages, and the cloying, sweet scent of sickness that clung to the upper floors. Each step was a stone tooth in the tower's throat, and she was being slowly swallowed. The door to the master chamber was at the top of the stairs, a monstrous slab of black oak. The iron handle was cold, not with the simple cold of metal, but with a profound, final coldness, like a hand reaching out from a grave. She paused before it, her own hand hovering, her breath catching in her throat. Behind this door was not just her mistress, but a terrible promise that had haunted her sleep and shadowed her waking hours for months. Mrs. Treverton's words, whispered with a feverish intensity weeks ago, echoed in her mind. When the time comes, Sarah, you will be with me. I will not die until I have told you. Gathering a courage she did not feel, Sarah pushed the heavy door open. It swung inward on groaning hinges, revealing a room that felt less like a bedroom and more like a cavern. The space was immense, the ceiling lost in a cathedral of shadows far above. Most of the grand, imposing furniture, the wardrobes built for giants, the chaise longues upholstered in faded velvet were draped in white dust cloths, making them look like a congregation of silent, hunched ghosts, patiently waiting for a funeral to begin. The only light, the only anchor in this swimming darkness, came from a single candle on the nightstand. It was a small, brave flame, fighting a losing battle against the oppressive gloom. Its light flickered and jumped with every draft that snaked through the ill-fitting window frame, making the shadows on the wall writhe and coil like living things. And in the center of this vast, dark stage, in the heart of a four-poster bed large enough to be a tomb, lay Mrs. Treverton. Sarah approached slowly, her footsteps muffled by the thick, threadbare carpet. The constant roar of the sea outside seemed to grow louder, more intimate, as if the waves were not just breaking on the cliffs, but inside the room itself a hollow, endless booming. It was the sound of something vast and indifferent, a sound that made a human life feel impossibly small and fragile. Her mistress was a landscape of decay. The candlelight was cruel, carving deep shadows into her face until her cheekbones stood out like sharp ridges and her eyes were cavernous pits. Her skin, once famed for its fairness, was now a waxy, translucent white, stretched so tight over the bone that she resembled a delicate porcelain doll that had been cracked and left in the dark. A faint, rattling sound accompanied each shallow breath, a dry leaf skittering across stone. She was terrifyingly still, a sculpture of imminent death, and yet Sarah could feel a will of iron still burning somewhere in that frail, failing body. Sarah stood by the bed, her hands clenched so tightly her knuckles were white. She was a simple girl, a housemaid whose life had been measured by polishing silver and mending linen. She was not equipped for this. This was a secret that belonged to the grand and the powerful, to the ancient family whose name was carved into the very stones of this tower. Why her? Why had she been chosen as its keeper? The fear that gripped her was a complex, layered thing. There was the primal fear of death, of being in the presence of its slow, deliberate work. But beneath that was a sharper, more specific terror. It was the fear of the secret itself. For years, she had felt its presence in the house, an unspoken tension that stained the air and lurked behind the polite smiles of the Treverton family. It was a ghost that needed no chains to rattle, a poison that had been slowly working its way through the foundations of the great house. And soon that poison would be poured into her ear. Mrs. Treverton had promised. "The truth is a burden, Sarah," her mistress had rasped during one of her more lucid moments. "But it is a greater burden to carry it alone into the grave. You are strong. You will bear it." Strong? Sarah felt as if she were made of glass. The blood was humming a frantic, panic tune in her ears. She looked at the woman in the bed, this matriarch of a proud lineage, and saw not just a dying employer, but a gatekeeper. A gatekeeper to a past so terrible that it had to be hidden away in the highest room of the most remote tower in Cornwall, guarded by the wind and the sea. The weight of that unseen secret was a physical presence in the room. It was heavier than the antique furniture, colder than the stone walls, pressed down on the air, making it difficult to breathe. It was a specter, waiting patiently at the foot of the bed for Mrs. Treverton to finally give it a name. Sarah imagined it as a dark shape, a stain, something that, once revealed, could never be unseen. It would cling to her, follow her out of this room, and haunt her for the rest of her days. A log in the great fireplace, long thought dead, suddenly collapsed with a soft sigh of ash, sending a brief flurry of orange sparks up the chimney. The small sound was like a gunshot in the charged silence, and Sarah jumped, a small, choked gasp escaping her lips. Her movement, or perhaps the sound, stirred something in the woman on the bed. Slowly, as if moving a great weight, Mrs. Treverton's eyelids fluttered open. For a moment, they were unfocused, milky with sickness. Then they found Sarah, the pupils tiny black dots in a sea of gray, sharpened with a sudden, terrifying clarity. The intelligence was back. The iron will had resurfaced from the depths of her illness. There was no recognition in that gaze, no softness. There was only a singular, desperate purpose. Her dry, cracked lips parted. No sound came out, only a faint puff of air, a dry rustle. Her hand, lying limp on the velvet coverlet, twitched. The fingers, skeletal and pale, curled slightly, a weak, beckoning gesture. She was trying to speak. She was trying to unburden herself. The time had come, and as Sarah leaned closer, drawn in by a horrified fascination she could not resist, the roar of the sea outside seemed to swell into a final, deafening crescendo, as if nature itself was trying to shout down the terrible words before they could ever be spoken. The gathering darkness in the room was no longer just an absence of light. It was an entity, watching, waiting, and ready to claim its due. As Mrs. Treverton's eyes locked onto hers, Sarah felt a cold dread snake up her spine, tightening its coils around her heart. The frail, dying woman was gone. In her place was a will of pure, unbending iron, a force of nature summoned for one final task. The air in the room, already heavy with the scent of sickness and the sea, seemed to grow thick and unbreathable, charged with a terrible, imminent energy. This was it. The moment she had been dreading for months was finally upon her. The mistress's cracked lips peeled back from her teeth, not in a smile, but in a grimace of extreme effort. A sound emerged from her throat, but it was not a word. It was a dry, rasping noise, like old parchment being torn. A sound utterly devoid of humanity. It was the sound of a body failing its master, of vocal cords refusing their final command. Her jaw worked silently, a desperate, horrifying pantomime of speech. Sarah leaned closer, her own breath held captive in her lungs, her ears straining to catch a single syllable, a single clue to the poison she was about to receive. But there was nothing, only that awful, clicking rasp and the relentless roar of the storm outside. Frustration, stark and terrible, flashed in the dying woman's eyes. Her will was afire, but her body was ash. Her strength was failing. The effort to speak had cost her dearly, and a new wave of waxy pallor washed over her features. But she was not done. With a resolve that seemed to defy the very laws of death, her left hand began a slow, agonizing journey across the velvet coverlet. It trembled violently, a pale, skeletal spider crawling across a dark expanse. Sarah watched, mesmerized and horrified, as the hand lifted an inch from the bed, the fingers wavering in the air. It was pointing. Her finger, thin as a bird's bone, was aimed at the far side of the room. Sarah's gaze followed the unsteady gesture towards a piece of furniture half swallowed by the shadow's tall, dark secretary desk. It was an ancient, imposing thing of black wood, its surface dulled by time. Her mistress's finger trembled, pointing specifically at one of its small, brass-handled drawers. The letter, Sarah knew it instantly. The unspoken words, the unspeakable secret, had been given a physical form. It was in there, locked away in that wooden box, waiting. The knowledge hit her with the force of a physical blow. A written confession was somehow worse, more permanent. A whispered word could be forgotten, misremembered, dismissed as feverish rambling. But words set down in ink on paper, that was evidence. That was a truth that could not be denied. A ghost given flesh. The drawer was no longer a part of the desk. It was a tomb, and her mistress was commanding her to open it. The pointing arm wavered, then fell back to the bed with a soft, defeated thud. The flash of strength was gone. Mrs. Treverton's head lolled to the side, her eyes fluttering, threatening to close for good. A low moan escaped her lips, a sound of pure, soul-deep despair. She had failed to speak it, and now she had failed to show it. The secret was still trapped inside her, a prisoner in a crumbling jail. For a moment, Sarah thought it was over. She thought death had finally won. But then, something changed. Mrs. Treverton's gaze, which had been lost in the shadows, began a slow, deliberate crawl across the room. It moved past Sarah, past the flickering candle, and came to rest on the nightstand beside the bed. There, next to a silver cup of water, sat a small glass vial. It was her medicine, a powerful restorative draught, the doctor had called it. He had left it with the sternest of warnings, his voice sharp and severe in Sarah's memory. A spoonful to give her strength when the faintness comes on. But mark my words, girl, no more than that. A spoonful at a time. The dose is potent. Any more would be a dangerous, perhaps even fatal, shock to her heart. A spoonful. Just enough to grant a few precious moments of clarity. A new light kindled in Mrs. Treverton's eyes. Not the fire of frustration, but the cold, calculating gleam of a gambler staking everything on one final, desperate throw of the dice. Her gaze was fixed on the vial with a terrifying intensity. It was no longer medicine. It was a key. It was the last ounce of strength she needed to finally unburden her soul before the darkness took her completely. Sarah saw the intent form in her mistress's eyes, and a new, more immediate panic seized her. This was a different kind of danger. This was not about a secret. This was about a life. "Madam, no," Sarah whispered, her voice trembling. "Please, you must not." She took a step forward, her hands half raised as if to intervene. But she was frozen by the chasm of station that separated them. She was a maid. This was her mistress. Her body screamed at her to snatch the vial away, but a lifetime of servitude held her in place. The doctor said, she began, her plea lost in the rising wind. But Mrs. Treverton was not listening. She was beyond hearing, beyond caution, beyond fear of anything but dying with her secret untold. With a galvanic surge of energy that was shocking in its suddenness, her hand shot out from the bedclothes. It was no longer the trembling, weak hand of moments ago. It was a claw, animated by a singular, obsessive purpose. Her fingers, surprisingly strong, closed around the small glass bottle. "Madam, for God's sake," Sarah cried out, her voice a sharp crack of fear in the immense room. Ignoring her completely, Mrs. Treverton brought the vial to her lips. She did not bother with the spoon. With her head tilted back and her eyes squeezed shut, she tipped the bottle up. Sarah heard the distinct, liquid sound of the entire contents being drained in one desperate gulp. It was a swift, brutal, and utterly final act. The empty vial slipped from her fingers, hitting the thick carpet with a dull, muffled clink. For a single, terrifying second, nothing happened. Then Mrs. Treverton's eyes snapped open. They were wide, impossibly wide, staring at the canopy above as if seeing some unspeakable horror materialize in the shadows. A low, guttural sound, half gasp, half sigh, escaped her lips. Her entire body went rigid, her back arching slightly off the mattress. It was a brief, violent convulsion. And then, as suddenly as it began, it was over. All the tension, all the will, all the life drained out of her at once. Her head fell back against the pillows with a dreadful finality. The rattling in her chest ceased. The shallow breaths stopped. An absolute, profound silence descended upon the room, a silence made all the more deafening by the storm that continued to rage outside. Sarah stood rooted to the spot, her mind a whirlwind of white-hot terror. She stared at the still figure in the bed, at the waxy face now peaceful in a way it hadn't been in months. The doctor's words echoed in her ears. A death knell. A dangerous, perhaps even fatal, shock to her heart. She hadn't just taken the medicine for strength. She had known the risk. She had drunk every last drop, defying the warning, embracing the danger. Sarah's blood ran cold as the horrifying realization dawned. This wasn't a desperate gamble for a few more moments of life to tell a secret. This was a suicide. She had killed herself, not out of despair, but with purpose. Faced with the inability to speak her truth, she had chosen the only other option, to silence it and herself, forever. The secret was not just a burden to be shared. It was a monster to be slain, and her own life had been the price of its destruction. For a long, terrible moment, the only sound in the universe was the frantic, useless hammering of Sarah's own heart. Then, even that seemed to fade, swallowed by a silence so absolute, so profound, it felt like a physical weight pressing down on the room. The constant, rattling breath of the dying woman had been a strange sort of companion in the oppressive gloom. A rhythm that proved life, however faint, was still present. Now its absence created a vacuum, a void that was infinitely more terrifying than the struggle that had preceded it. The silence was not peaceful. It was the silence of a tomb that had just been sealed. Outside, the storm seemed to feel the change. It was as if the wind and sea had been holding their breath along with Sarah. And now, with the finality of death, they unleashed a new and terrible fury. A colossal wave, larger than all the rest, struck the base of the tower with a boom so deep it vibrated up through the stone floor, making Sarah's teeth ache. It was not a sound of nature. It was a sound of rage, or perhaps a sound of triumph. The beast outside had claimed the soul within. Sarah remained frozen, a statue of terror carved from flesh and bone. Her gaze was fixed on the bed, on the still form of her mistress. Mrs. Treverton's face, moments before a mask of desperate struggle, was now eerily placid. The lines of pain had smoothed, the tautness of her skin had relaxed. In death, a kind of youthfulness had returned to her features, a serene and waxen beauty that was profoundly unnatural. It was the peace of a fortress that has held its secrets against the final siege. That horrifying serenity was the most damning evidence of all. She had won. The secret was safe. Then it happened. A sudden, violent gust of wind, a concentrated spear of air born of the gale's fury, slammed against the tall, arched window. The ancient leaded glass rattled in its frame with a sound like chattering teeth. The wooden shutters, latched from the inside, strained against the iron bolt, groaning as if a great shoulder were being thrown against them from the outside. The storm wanted in. It wanted to sweep through the room, to claim the silence, to perhaps read the secret for itself. And in that moment of violent assault, the single candle flame the room's tiny, flickering heart was nearly extinguished. It was sucked sideways, flattened into a long blue sliver of light that barely clung to the wick. The room plunged into a disorienting, near-total darkness. The great, hulking shapes of the furniture dissolved into an inky blackness. The body on the bed vanished. For a terrifying second, Sarah was utterly blind, alone in the roaring dark with a fresh corpse and a buried truth. Then, as the gust passed, the flame sputtered, coughed, and fought its way back to life. It was a weak, pathetic thing now, smaller and less certain than before, casting shadows that were deeper and seemed to writhe with a new, malevolent energy. The air in the room, Sarah swore, had dropped in temperature. A chilling cold, far colder than any simple draft, crept over her skin, raising goosebumps on her arms and the back of her neck. It was the cold of the grave, a chill that had nothing to do with the weather and everything to do with what had just transpired. Her eyes, now accustomed to the weaker light, were drawn away from the bed. The body was now just a fact, a terrible, static thing. The true horror, the active, living horror, was elsewhere. Her gaze drifted, as if pulled by an invisible string, across the room to the dark secretary desk. The desk where Mrs. Treverton had pointed. The desk that held the letter. It no longer looked like a piece of furniture. In the wavering, sickly candlelight, it had transformed. It seemed to loom larger, its dark wood absorbing the light, its polished surfaces reflecting nothing. It was a dark altar upon which a life had just been sacrificed. And the small drawer, the one with the tarnished brass handle, was its focal point. It was a sealed mouth, a closed eye, a tiny coffin holding not a body, but a truth so monstrous it was worth dying for. Sarah stared at it, her terror shifting from the visceral shock of death to a deep, psychological dread. The letter was in there. The words, the ink on the paper, the secret given a form she could hold, a shape she could read. A part of her, a tiny, morbidly curious part, felt a pull towards it. What could it be? What unspeakable shame? What hidden crime? What devastating revelation could be worth this price? A secret of stolen inheritance? A hidden, illegitimate child? No, it felt worse than that. Those were secrets of greed and passion. This secret felt like something else entirely. It felt like a stain, a corruption that didn't just affect a life or a fortune, but a soul. A truth that could poison bloodlines, that could make the very name of Treverton a curse. The thought of opening that drawer was more terrifying than touching the cold flesh of her dead mistress. She imagined her fingers closing around the cold brass handle. She imagined the drawer sliding open with a soft, woody sigh. She imagined pulling out the folded paper, feeling its weight in her trembling hand. The spidery, weak scrawl of a dying woman's script. And then the reading. The words that, once seen, could never be unseen. The knowledge that would burn itself behind her eyes and follow her into every dream and every waking moment for the rest of her life. Mrs. Treverton had meant to pass the burden to her. With her final, suicidal act, she had failed. Or had she? The burden was still there, sitting in that drawer, waiting. It was a choice. Her mistress had taken her own choice away, but she had left one for Sarah, to know or not to know, to become the new keeper of the flame, or to let it be extinguished forever. A wave of nausea and vertigo washed over her. She couldn't do it. She couldn't be the one. The weight of it would crush her. This secret belonged to the night, to the storm, to the cold, dead stones of Porthgenna Tower. It did not belong in the heart of a simple maid. Slowly, deliberately, Sarah took a step backward. Her shoe made no sound on the thick carpet. Another step. She was retreating from the desk, from the bed, from the whole terrible tableau. Her eyes were still locked on the drawer, a tiny rectangle of shadow that held a universe of horror. She felt like an intruder who had stumbled upon a scene of ancient, dark worship and had to escape before the god of that place realized she was there. She reached the great oak door, her hand fumbling behind her for the cold iron handle. Her fingers closed around it, and the contact with its solid reality was the only thing that kept her from screaming. She pulled the door open just enough to slip through, not daring to turn her back on the room. One last look. The scene was burned into her memory. The weak candle, the immense, silent bed, the looming, dark desk, and the raging storm outside, forever framing the echoing silence within. The secret of Porthgenna Tower had not been revealed. It had been buried, and Sarah Leeson, frozen in the doorway, knew with a certainty that chilled her to the bone that she was now its sole, terrified, and unwilling guard. The silence in that room was not empty. It was screaming. The truth was sealed in that dark room, leaving only a terrible, echoing question. What hidden truth could be so awful, so shameful, that it was worth dying for? What do you think the secret could be? Leave your darkest guesses in the comments below.